When it comes to regulating mean arterial pressure, in addition to cardiac output and systemic vascular resistance, we need to consider blood volume. As blood volume affects a number of different areas, it affects venous return, it's going to affect afterload, it affects systemic vascular resistance. And so blood volume is the other part of this regulation process. And so we actually have two reflexes that are involved in the regulation of blood volume, and they tend to work opposite of one another. The first is what we call the atrial stretch reflex. So in the atrium, there are, once again, mechanical receptors. And as the atrium stretches, if it stretches too much, well, not really too much, but if it stretches a lot and activates those mechanical receptors, that's going to generate an action potential in the sensory neurons, which sends that information. Actually, it doesn't send the information anywhere. What it does is activate the secretion all within the heart. This is a reflex contained locally. It activates the secretion of the atrial natriuretic peptide, or just natriuretic peptides. There's actually more than one, but so I should probably say peptides, plural. And these peptides enter into the bloodstream. What they're going to do is inhibit the release of aldosterone and ADH. Now, why do we care? Just as a reminder, ADH, okay, when ADH levels are high, what this is going to stimulate is water reabsorption in the kidneys. And so if we reabsorb water in the kidneys, what we are doing is essentially increasing blood volume. So what this leads to is increased blood volume, decreased urine volume. So let me change that a little bit. I want to add an inhibition, so like that. So urine volume goes down. And then as blood volume goes up, of course, naturally, we're going to increase my venous return. Which increases my cardiac output. And so we have this increase in blood pressure. So when ADH goes up, blood pressure is essentially increased. Natriuretic protein, peptides, so these actually inhibit the release of ADH. So I'm going to write ANP for the atrial natriuretic peptides. Now, ADH, not the only thing, of course, we have aldosterone, which I've mentioned before too. What this does is when aldosterone is released, it increases the absorption of sodium, while at the same time inhibiting the reabsorption of potassium. Kind of running out of room, but reabsorption. I'm just going to write reabsorb for both of, that is going to refer to both of them. And so when sodium levels in the blood go up, what that's going to do is blood sodium levels, that's going to increase osmosis and the movement of water out of the kidneys to the blood. And that's going to have the same effect as before. As water is reabsorbed, blood volume goes up, venous return goes up. And so again, the atrial natriuretic peptide is going to inhibit the release of the aldosterone. Now the renin-angiotensin system does exactly the opposite. we're going to go over the renin-angiotensin system in more detail again in the renal system, but it doesn't hurt you to learn it twice. In the kidneys, there are cells that respond to blood pressure, and again, they're going to contain mechanoreceptors that recognize an increase in blood pressure. So if mean arterial pressure, or actually a change in blood pressure, I should say. So if mean arterial pressure is too low, okay, so a decrease in the mean arterial pressure is going to stimulate the release of a substance called renin. So the stimulus is low mean arterial pressure, which actually means high if I can continue with the process that I've been using. So high mean arterial pressure actually inhibits this. So as mean arterial pressure is high, it's going to inhibit that. I'm going to do an arrow in parentheses to say my pressure is too high. It's going to inhibit renin. And just to make it perfectly crystal clear, I'm going to write my pressure too low. It's going to stimulate the release of renin, just because I want to make it crystal clear what we're dealing with here. Now, renin is an enzyme, and this enzyme catalyzes a chemical reaction. The chemical reaction it's going to catalyze is the liver produces a protein called angiotensinogen. A lot of times when you see this O-gen, it means the protein's not active. But angiotensinogen is going to undergo a chemical reaction catalyzed by the enzyme renin. And that chemical reaction is going to convert angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is also not active, so we're going to write inactive here. Inactive here, doesn't have any biological function that I'm aware of, unless there's something newly discovered that I haven't learned about yet. But angiotensin 1 is then going to go to the lungs. Actually, it travels all over the circulation system, but in the lungs there's an enzyme called the angiotensin converting enzyme, so I'm going to abbreviate that ACE. And angiotensinogen is the chemical reaction is catalyzed by ACE, and we end up with angiotensin 2. And then angiotensin 2 has a number of different effects. I'm not going to get into the mechanism of it, but there are many different tissues that have receptors to angiotensin 2. Neuronal tissue has receptors, so the brain tissue has receptors. By the way, the abbreviation for this is angio2, like so. So receptors for angio2, whoops, be nice if I actually wrote what I need to. Anyway, for the angiotensin 2 are found in the brain, found in the hypothalamus, and I think found in the heart, found in the lungs, and in other tissues of the body. But the reason I'm going to list this is, interestingly enough, our good friend, the SARS-2 virus, otherwise known as the coronavirus, which gives us the disease COVID-19, actually binds to that angiotensin 2. And if you think about the things that COVID-19 does to you, obviously it affects the lungs. It can cause some serious heart problems, and it can cause some neurological problems. This is one of the reasons for the strange change in your ability to smell. But as far as blood pressure goes, essentially what angiotensin 2 is going to do is it's actually going to inhibit the release of nope, I lied. It's not going to inhibit it. I had to think about what it's doing. It's going to increase blood pressure. So it's going to, because my stimulus for it is my low blood pressure. So in order to maintain homeostasis, if his blood pressure goes too low, we need to increase blood pressure. And we're going to do that by stimulating the release of aldosterone and ADH. I'm going to abbreviate aldosterone, ALD. And those, of course, are going to increase water reabsorption. Osmolarity of the blood for ALD is going to change. But that's not the only things that it does. It also will increase, stimulate the cardiovascular control center, which will then increase cardiac output. And it will stimulate the release of norepinephrine from those sympathetic fibers, again through the cardiovascular control center, and it's going to increase systemic vascular resistance too. So you can see we're affecting all of the big ones with this system with renin. We call this the renin angiotensin aldosterone system. So RAAS, or sometimes just RAS, both mean exactly the same thing. This would stand for renin, angiotensin, or aldosterone angiotensin system, whereas this is renin angiotensin system. It's basically the same system. And so you can see we would increase blood pressure and compensate for the fact that we have low blood pressure using this system. Decreases urine output, elevates blood volume, and essentially is going to restore homeostasis.